short notice if you just learned of the event and otherwise. So we're going to talk tonight about ABA 626, which is deemed the Homemade Food Act. We have three speakers tonight. We have Christina, Oatfield, Peter Ruddock, and Katie Valenzuela. Thank you. And so we'll probably break this up in a couple of sections. First, we'd like to start off with, since we have a small audience tonight, maybe everyone can go around and introduce themselves, maybe say your name, and if you're with an organization or part of the Grange, and maybe why you were interested in coming tonight. We'll try to keep those really short. And then the next section, each one of our speakers will introduce themselves and talk about their history and relationship to the bill itself. Then we can go into another section where we'll talk about the pros and cons of the bill. And our speakers will have kind of a moderated discussion amongst them. And then we'll conclude with any questions from the audience. Okay? Sound good? Thanks. And so I will, also I just wanted to note, and we'll kind of do this with some introductions, but we have three co-hosts tonight. So one, the Live Oak Grange, obviously they're being our venue host, and Shelley can tell you a little, Sherry is probably the best person to tell you about the Live Oak Grange.
Shall I start the introduction?
Yeah.
We can move around the room.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And then we'll just say the other hosts are Slow Food Santa Cruz, and there's three board members here. And my name's Stephanie Webb. I'm on the board, and then Tyler and Penny. And they'll also talk about their introductions, and then also Open Farm Tours, which Penny is the champion and leader for. And she can talk a little bit about that and try to recruit some volunteers for that, if you'd like. And that's all. Okay, great.
So hi everyone, welcome to our Grange Hall. My name is Sherry, and I'm accompanied here with other Grange members. Raise your hand. They're a Grange member, yes. So we have our president, Lauren Linkmeyer, her husband, Mac, Penny, our ag committee chair, and Daniel, who is our gatekeeper.
Parking supervisor.
Just a little bit about the Grange. Practical matters, the bathrooms are down that hallway and to your left. That's always a good thing to know. We have a membership of about 120 people right now, mostly from the Live Oak Greater Santa Cruz area. And this Grange was constructed by farmers in the local community. They donated their labor and they bought this property and they built the hall all together. And so there's a new generation here that's keeping it open, and we're so happy to host this event tonight. We're always really happy to support initiatives that improve equitable access to food and also just the organic movement and resiliency. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can kind of start back here and then go around like a snake. Our videographer.
Mm-hmm. Herb, do you want to introduce yourself?
Who are you, Herb?
Herb
Moore.
Video. Okay. Would you like to go next, sir?
My name's Kevin Olson.
Hello, Kevin.
Hi.
Did you want to say why you're interested in coming this evening, or?
I just wanted to hear the
Okay.
food industry.
Okay.
What's
Great.
your affiliation?
The food?
Yeah.
Well, I've got a restaurant, and
Oh.
I make wine. I have a winery. And then I have a produce company where I sell cauliflower, romaine, mixed melons.
Okay. Thanks.
I'm Daniel. I'm president and vice president. I work my way down to and parking supervisor and hall manager.
Hello, my name is Cesario Ruiz, and I'm here representing wearing two hats. One of them is I work for El Pájaro Community Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit focused on supporting people who want to start businesses. We also own a commercial kitchen incubator, which is a 9,000 square foot facility down in Watsonville. One of my main jobs there, besides managing the kitchen, is provide technical assistance for anybody who wants to start a business, and this is part of what we do there. We guide people to obtain all the proper permits in order for them to come and work at the commercial kitchen. We currently have over 30 different clients, and I am one of the clients. I also have my food business, and I run it out of the kitchen. So this topic is relevant to me to continue passing on information for future food entrepreneurs.
So, Cesario, some of your clients started out as cottage food operators and then moved into the kitchen?
So far, we haven't had any of those cases actually happen. Seems like the cottage food has kept people right on that same level to only do so much, but we're always welcome to accept people who want to expand their production.
So for those of you who don't know, and I am one of those people who don't know about the cottage food bill, or which is, I think, a predecessor to what this AB 226 is, right? No, 626. Thanks. So we'll get into that a little bit. I think Christina will introduce some more facts about that. So we'll just try to stay with 3-minute introductions.
Hi, my name is Rachel Hughes. I'm a caterer. I own a business out of Santa Cruz, and I was trying to get a cottage food law, but it's very restrictive. You can't have any dairy or like any prepared foods or soups or things, so that really didn't work for me. So I'm interested in this, so I can actually do more of what I do out of my own kitchen. So it'd be helpful for me. So I just want to know more about it. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth, and I'm from San Luis. I took a vacation to Santa Cruz, went to the Felton Farmers Market, because I live by the farmers markets. Went to Cesario, and it says bought some of his jam. Cesario was like, come tonight. I'm a dietitian. I teach nutrition and culinary arts at Cuesta College and Cal Poly. And I know Mark Stambler, who had a part in the Cottage Food Act for California. So it feels very serendipitous right now.
Great. Welcome. Yeah.
Hi everybody, my name is Maria Cadenas. I'm with Santa Cruz Community Ventures, and we focus on creating compassionate and equitable local economies that align with the well-being of the community. Right now we're looking into creating a community investment fund that focuses on supporting employee-owned cooperatives in the region. One of the areas that we're looking into is ag and food, and how that would work in that space. So glad to be here.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Chad. I came because Elizabeth, I work with her, and she asked me to come with her.
So I'm Elizabeth Bourget. I'm a member of the United States Personal Chef Association. Been a personal chef for 16 years. And so we're kind of really watching how this is going. I think it's an advantage, but some of the people in this industry don't. So it'd be good to hear both sides. Because I know that there are a lot of people that are cooking in their homes and delivering food, not following the rules, and there are those of us that are. So we're just kind of curious. But I also am moving to Aromas in a year, so I may be opening a business if this law passes, where I can do some food delivery separate from personal chefing. So I want to basically get information, give back to our organization.
Okay.
I'm Tyler Oxford. I'm one of the Slow Food Santa Cruz board members, one of the newer board members. And I love sustainability, everything environmental. I have an environmental engineering degree and a renewable energy sustainable development degree separately. So when I was asked to be part of Slow Food Santa Cruz and join the board, I said yes. And so that's why I'm here.
I'm Penny Ellis, and I'm a Granger, and I do the open farm tours, and I'm really happy to be here tonight because I didn't think that I would be. I was in Vermont and Massachusetts for the last 2 weeks studying their food system, which is incredible. And anyways, I'm just really happy to be here tonight and be hearing more about this bill, because it's something that I can see myself doing as well.
This is Mac. I'm
Lauren. We
Spokesmodel.
Yeah. So, president of the Grange, taking over from Sherry, who's been doing an amazing job for the last 3 years as president. Monica Stewart, we have a small farm in Aptos, a catering company that's on hold right now while we renegotiate our commercial kitchen, finding a new space. And your steward of the Grange right now. Yeah. It's easier just to do it together.
And they raise very cute goats.
That's it.
Okay, and I'm again Stephanie Webb. I'm on the board of Slow Food Santa Cruz. I also work a lot in fishy business and started a lot of community-supported fisheries and fishermen cooperatives in the North Central California area, and try to support as many value-based seafood intermediaries that we have in our community. And so for those of you who don't know, Slow Food as an organization was founded in Italy and kind of in opposition to fast food, and really supports good, clean, fair food, and also honors the social and cultural aspects of food, and that we can build community around eating together and keeping producers and consumers connected, as well as recognizing our resources and protecting our environment. So for me, it was just, it's an inclusive catch-all to what and aligns with my worldviews. And I like to participate in as much of these things that I can, and really bridge the gaps between the work that's been done in agriculture and what's happening in the seafood industry. We've spent, almost 4 decades focusing on how to get a sustainable agricultural system with still huge hurdles, but the normal consumer level of information that's available around seafood is just in its infancy by comparison. So turning towards and building connections with like-minded people who have an educational level of ag, and to try to get them to bring those convictions and opportunities and open-mindedness into the seafood world as well. So, if you have any questions about fish, I can help you with that. And then I'll turn it over to, and I'm playing moderator, if you haven't noticed tonight. But I'll turn it over to our speakers here. I think we'll start with.
All right. Well,
no, yeah. No?
Yeah. Yes, okay. Perfect. Good evening. Thank you for hosting us. As was said, my name is Katie Valenzuela. I'm the staffer for the author of this bill, Assemblymember Valenzuela-Garcia. Actually, 99% of my job is climate policy. I'm the consultant for the legislature's Joint Climate Change Policies Committee. But I had been working on this bill from before I came to work for the committee, and so they knew that I would just bug the heck out of any staffer who took this bill on after I left, so they let me keep working on it, which was probably a good decision on their part. But I came to work on this bill when I was a consultant in the Sacramento area. I'd been doing work with nonprofits in the Sacramento area for a really long time, and kept finding that I couldn't really do the work that I wanted to do in the way that I thought it needed to be done. So I opened my own consulting firm and had contracts that worked on the urban agriculture ordinances in Sacramento. I've staffed the Sacramento Food Policy Council for those folks for a while. Did a lot of statewide, more environmental justice work. And at the time when I started my firm, I was only interested in working with nonprofit organizations and community groups, and that was really what I was focused on doing, even though I myself wasn't a nonprofit. That was my target niche. And then I met these guys from an organization, a company in the Bay Area called Josephine. They were looking for folks to help them run a bill that would legalize homemade food sales across the state of California. And being food people, tech guys in the Bay Area, had no idea how to get that done. And after meeting with them several times, I decided to take on the contract with my friend Khalif Asagay, who was the lead on that contract, and we staffed the bill from them when it was first introduced by Assemblymember Cheryl Brown in 2016. So this is the third legislative year that we've been working on this bill. The bill stopped really quickly when we introduced it for the first time. You can imagine this text just kind of dropped on people and everybody just had like heart attacks across the city of Sacramento, like you can almost hear it. Everybody was just like, what are you trying to do? So we pulled it immediately and convened a group of environmental health regulators, actually. A lot of environmental health regulators are obviously have strong concerns with this bill, but there are also several who recognize that they would shut somebody down and come back in 2 weeks and they'd be making tamales again, that they knew that the system as it was construed wasn't meeting the need as it was existing in the community. And so we really leaned on them to tell us, if we're going to do this, how would it look? So the reason the bill is so long and structured the way it is that it was written almost in its entirety by environmental health officers in this working group that we met with for over a year. So they told us how the inspections need to happen. They told us what things made sense, what things didn't make sense in a home, you know, how we would do the permitting process. All of that was structured by them. We took all of their amendments until we couldn't anymore because they had to stop engaging because the counties and other health people opposed, and they're obviously very closely related, so they had to sort of step out. So we reintroduced the bill with Mr. Garcia at the beginning of 2017. The bill has taken several amendments to try to make it through the process. Most recently, changes that we made include, like you can do unannounced inspections is another thing that we just had to take because people were really nervous that the inability to just drop in on somebody, even if they didn't get a complaint, would really hinder their ability to follow their instincts when they thought something was going awry with a certain operation. But basically the way the bill is constructed is it's an opt-in for counties, and so each county in the state will choose whether or not this is a permit that they would offer. So if they don't have the capacity to do it or politically don't want to do it, they wouldn't have to. A cook would then be able to apply to the local health department like they would for any restaurant or commercial space kitchen. They would receive the same inspection. That person would walk through, they'd walk through everything, all the equipment they were going to use. The permit would have to spell out what they were going to cook, when they were going to be cooking, so like hours of operation, because that way, you know, we always talk about like we don't want something, an unannounced inspection can't happen at like 6 p.m. on Tuesday if you're making dinner for your kids, you know, like it's got to happen on Monday when you said you're going to be making and selling your tamales, because that's when you prepared your kitchen and are using it just for that purpose. But then once you get the permit, you have the permit and you're able to sell, similar to cottage food, up to $50,000 a year worth of food. It's all direct sales, so it's explicitly not allowing folks to hire other companies to come in. It's supposed to be like employee, like the person who's running the operation, and maybe if they have one employee, those are the people who would deliver the food. They have to have a driver's license on file. I mean, there's systems, and we put in all these like really technical protections to ensure that those folks would be following the law. And yeah, that's basically what the idea is to open the door. If you look at my kitchen and my kitchen counter space is this big and I say I'm gonna make 1,000 tamales a week, like the home inspector has the ability to be like, how about 100 a week, you know? Like I think you've got that space safely. So it's really made to give a lot of discretion to the local health officers. So based on the different setup and what the person's proposing to do, they really still have the same ability to approve or deny the permit based on their expertise. And another component of this bill, which is turning into almost like what I call like the second bill that's within the same bill, is a slew of regulations around internet intermediaries that would engage in the space. So if we didn't do anything in the bill, anybody would be able to come into the space and do something. So what we did is define internet intermediaries. So if people use Facebook, if they use any sort of platform to advertise their food, we defined who those folks were, and we put in place a whole host of restrictions on those people that has caused a whole series of gray hairs on my head and stressful meetings with folks like Airbnb and Uber and Facebook who have been trying to chip away at even the basic level of provisions that we put in that bill. So we're forcing them to register, we're forcing them to comply with local enforcement officers if complaints are received, to pull down chefs if a local enforcement agency says the complaints have been received on that chef, to clearly and conspicuously post all fees, any fee changes. You know, another amendment that we'll put in next month will be whether or not they carry insurance that covers the food purchased through the platform, which was a big question, and also one of the big assets that some of these platforms offer is that they can provide liability insurance to these cooks without them having to purchase their own policy. And yeah, a whole host of things that has turned it into what is a very big step in regulating these folks that hasn't really happened legislatively before. So I know we'll talk more in detail about that, but that's sort of the parameters of the bill as it sits. And just to let you know where we're at is we've made it fully through the policy process in the legislature. We're currently sitting in the fiscal committee on the Senate side. If we are successful getting out of that committee, we would have a floor vote on the Senate and then come back for a concurrence vote in the Assembly. And if the governor signs it, it could become law on January 1st of 2019. So that's that. Thank you.
Cool. So I guess I'm next. Hi again, everyone. My name is Christina at Oatfield, and I'm so grateful that the Grange is hosting this conversation about this really important bill that has gotten relatively little media attention, considering how sort of monumental it is for the food movement and the development of the gig economy and tech economy in California. So I'll talk more about my opinions about the bill when we kind of like go to the next round, but just to give you some background on who I am. Several years ago, 8 years ago now, I had just graduated from college at UC Berkeley and helped start a student-run food co-op, a grocery co-op in Berkeley, and it opened successfully in the kind of peak of the recession era, and I found myself holding down like a bunch of different crappy part-time jobs, and then decided to use my passion for food, and with a friend of mine started like a kind of underground restaurant out of my home. And that was going on for a while, but it was a lot of work and I wasn't making a lot of money off of it, so it wrapped up before too long. But at that time I also started volunteering for the nonprofit where I now work, and I'm kind of representing on this little panel. The nonprofit is called the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and our organization is all about local and community-driven economic development, and specifically we're proponents of community ownership of all sorts of vital aspects of communities: food, energy, housing, jobs, etc. So what that means is that we do a lot of we're a team of lawyers and law students and policy wonks and activists, and we work to provide all different kinds of like legal and policy tools to promote worker-owned cooperatives, community land trusts and agricultural land trusts, and lots of other things like that to kind of help drive really like, you know, community-driven economic development. And so we got involved in a bill that you could argue lays some foundation for the conversation we're having here today. We actually did a lot of background research and sort of drafted the original proposal that got this bill going, the Cottage Food Law, also known as California's Homemade Food Act, which passed in 2012 and went into effect at the beginning of 2013. And so that was like one of my first projects that I worked on with the Sustainable Economies Law Center, given my like homemade food and like food business background. And I worked closely with Mark Stambler, who was mentioned by you, your friend, who was a bread baker who had just been busted by the Los Angeles County Department of Environmental Health for selling his famous homemade bread. And so I've been doing all this research on homemade food laws in other states and had sort of developed a proposal, and then Mark got busted, and that generated a flurry of media attention, which got the attention of his assembly member, Mike Gatto, who called him and said, I want to help. And next thing I knew, we had a bill being introduced in the legislature. And so, and that bill, like I mentioned, was signed into law in 2012. And so I'll explain kind of what that does, because that's what's currently allowed in the law. Everything else Katie was talking about was what could be forthcoming. So the Cottage Food Law, or Homemade Food Act that we have on the books currently, creates sort of a break or an exception from the default rule that if you want to make and sell food for the general public, it needs to be done in a commercial kitchen. Under the Cottage Food Law, you can get a cottage food permit from the Department of Environmental Health, which is the same agency that does restaurant and other kitchen inspections locally. And you can sell food either directly to consumers or through like a grocery market or a cafe, and there's like 2 different types of permits you might get depending on what kind of sales, direct or not, that you're doing. The challenge and sort of the shortcoming of the cottage food law is that there's a limited list of allowed foods, and I think a lot of you have seen it. It is very, very limited. It's only non-potentially hazardous foods, which basically means foods that are shelf stable, that don't need to be kept refrigerated. So like breads and other baked goods, jams, a lot of like dry snack foods like dried popcorn and like dried fruit and candy, and a bunch of other things like that. So it's great for people who want to make a food item that's on the list, but obviously it leaves out a lot of people and a lot of potential food enterprises. So we've sort of always had this vision that maybe there would be an expanded homemade food law in California someday, but we're just not supportive of the terms and conditions of AB 626, which I'll explain when we get more into the opinion section of this discussion. I'll let Peter introduce himself.
Okay, well, thanks. So, I'm Peter Ruddock, and I've got a couple of hats tonight. I'm on the board of Slow Food California. I won't tell you too much more about Slow Food because Stephanie did a good introduction of that. I'm a refugee from Silicon Valley and actually abandoned it full-time a number of years ago. Slow Food doesn't have any employees in California. We're all volunteers. I've been trying to figure out how to make a second career out of this, and not particularly worrying at any given point whether work is paid or not. It's an internship, it's a passion. I dove into Slow Food because I appreciate with it that we have a broken connection between the food system and people who are eating. They often don't know what they're eating or why it is. And that's what particularly interests me in things like the cottage food law and the current Homemade Food Operations Act. In fact, I've sort of created my own, I call it a three-legged stool, which is education, which comes from Slow Food mostly, and Economy, which is a cousin organization called Slow Money, which we won't talk much about, and then working on the policy. As somebody I heard recently said, actually his phrasing was the parable of teach a man to fish is wrong. I like to think it's not wrong, but it's insufficient. He has to be able to afford to buy a fishing pole, and he has to be allowed to go to the fishing hole. So you do need the three-legged stool. You need to know what to do and how you're doing it. You need to be able to afford to do it. You need to be allowed to do it. So being self-taught, my first attempt at policy was the cottage food law. And I didn't do a heck of a lot, but I was Christina's cheerleader, or she was my mentor about this law. I learned a lot from looking over her shoulder. I was on the Slow Food Santa Cruz board at the time, and did talk to the Sentinel, and otherwise cheer-led in a number of ways. We wrote a support letter. We were so happy that the law passed that we actually put together Slow Food Santa Cruz, quite a large event. We rented the Loudon Nelson Center for the afternoon. We got local politician, Christina came down. I was probably the MC that day. And we had a couple of food producers. And we celebrated the passage of the first law. We actually had permit holder number 1 for each of Monterey and Santa Cruz County. I know the Monterey one, Kathy's still in business. I don't know if Savannah still is. There have been a number of laws since then that I have been involved in because for the same reason I think they tend to reconnect people with their food. There have been laws in the last few years instantiating the farmer's market law. That one had some issues with it. Permits got more expensive for farmers, and some of us don't really want that to happen. We would like to think that farmers markets are public goods. We passed a law, and when I say we, I'm often a cheerleader, we, the state of California, to define CSAs, and it's a law that isn't particularly being enforced at the moment, in part because our local ag commissioners say it's unenforceable. I rather disagree with them. I think at least good parts of it are enforceable. Christina and Sustainable Economies Law Center passed the Neighborhood Food Act, which, am I correct in saying in a way it's like the right to garden, that there were restrictions on gardening and it removed those restrictions?
In certain circumstances.
In certain circumstances, right. Couldn't get a blanket removal for front yard gardens. But the idea, as Christina said, the cottage food law in 2012 was a foundation that we're looking at other ways to connect people with food, to relocalize food. There are more laws that we can go into later, but that just gives you an idea, a little bit of the evolution of where the local food policy has gone in the last few years, and where I have inserted myself into it. So I learned about this law in the very first pass. She was, the lawyer who was working for Josephine at the time was a friend of mine, and she said, "What do you think about this?" And I actually thought it wasn't particularly ready, as many laws aren't in the first year, but I was very intrigued by it. And so I've been paying attention to it, mostly with the Slow Food hat. Slow Food California is an umbrella organization for all the California chapters, has endorsed its support of this bill. And I've been paying attention. I was on some of the phone calls with the health departments that Katie talked about. The organization, the tech startup company, Josephine, went out of business early this year. They have, the founders, Matt and Charlie, have established a community-based organization called the Cook Alliance. It's not a 501c3 nonprofit. It doesn't at the moment have any form. But they've created a group of stakeholders, including themselves, and advisors. And so that's my other hat tonight. I am officially the advisor to the Cook Alliance, which is this community-based organization that is sponsoring the bill. We talk every couple of weeks. We look at the amendments before they're public. Katie is, she takes our emails. And we are looking at these things that she's talking about, the internet things, the safety things, the things that people care about. It's an interesting and fascinating process. It's one that if you are interested in, you can find your way into making a state law. I did. If you get in at a fairly significant level, it can become something of a job. Again, for me, the Cook Alliance advisor is not a paid job, but it's a passion.
Great.
And then we'll talk
So,
about
yeah, so then you guys kind of all mentioned a little bit about some opposition and then the internet stuff is really intriguing to me. But I think I'm also a little interested in hearing kind of an evolution of pros and cons. For me, with the cottage food law, what you saw as some of the pros and cons of that individually, and then maybe, right, because there had to be pros and cons for an opportunity for improvement or change, correct? So then maybe going on to what is being proposed now, and where some of your big opposition is. And then kind of Peter chime in with agreeing or other perspectives or what California Slow Food, if they had any kind of concerns with the bill. So I think that would maybe be a good way to go. Is that okay? Great. So Christina, you want to lead with it?
Yeah, I think probably everyone up here at the front of the room and probably everyone in the audience, probably everyone in this whole room basically would probably agree that the current cottage food law is probably too limited.
So this is the first time I've heard of that. So maybe I'm the only person in the room that's the first time I've heard of it, but I think I would like to take a step back to get a little less assumptions about what knowledge is.
Okay. Would it be helpful if I kind of explained a little bit more about how the current law works?
Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe the pros and cons of the current one. I don't know, I mean, how many people are familiar with the cottage food? So about half and half, maybe? Or maybe I'm the only one that doesn't know about it.
Sure, so just
a little bit.
Real quick, you can use the current cottage food law to just make those limited foods that I was mentioning a moment ago. If you want to make jams, jellies, fruit preserves, if you want to make fruit pies or fruit empanadas, if you want to make breads, cookies, churros, tortillas, and a few other baked goods or some other dry snack goods that are on the list, then you can apply for a permit from the local Department of Environmental Health. And once you get your permit or your registration in order, you need to adhere to some basic sanitary standards in your home kitchen. But it's not like having to turn your home kitchen into a commercial kitchen with all the stainless steel countertops and special flooring and everything like that. It's like you can use what a typical person would have in their home kitchen for producing those foods. There's some other requirements, like you need to have like a separate storage space for ingredients for your cottage food business that's separate from like the rest of your kind of personal food. There could be a kitchen inspection depending on whether you're which type of permit you're getting, which I can explain in a moment. And you're limited to $50,000 in gross annual sales. So besides the limited kind of array of foods, that's like one of the other major limitations is the $50,000 gross annual sales limit. Although I hear a lot of like philosophical complaints about how the state shouldn't limit a home cook's income, and that even if there is a limit, that limit is way too low because it's gross annual sales. So by the time you subtract out cost of ingredients and everything else, you're really not making that much money. And so it's not like a full-time living wage for someone in California. But practically speaking, I don't know many cottage food producers who are at or exceeding that limit. I think just there's a lot of other natural constraints to using a home kitchen. So some cottage food producers I know that have gained a bit of traction with their business have moved on up into a commercial kitchen before they hit that $50,000 gross annual sales. But there is a lot of really valid criticisms of the $50,000 gross annual sales limit. But the main issue is that those foods are all fine if that's like the food you're passionate about making, but it's just such a limited array of foods. And there's also been some criticism that the list has a lot of sugary foods, like you might notice like jams and candy and stuff like that are like foods like known to have a lot of sugar in them, and it just kind of happens that a lot of those foods are like less likely to spoil if left on a countertop. So the food safety regulators, the environmental health regulators, were more comfortable allowing those foods to be made from a home kitchen. And so that's why the list of foods, we were just trying to get all the foods included that we could get away with. The political dynamics passing this bill in 2012 were quite different than they are now. I think the environmental health regulators' concerns carried a lot more weight when we were working on the cottage food law. I can try and speculate more on why that is in a moment. So that's the major limitation is the limited array of foods.
May I?
Sure.
You could say with potentially hazardous that there are two ways of looking at it. The way that environmental health will look at it is always through a lens of germ. and they are less hazardous because they won't spoil and get germs. Because they are sugar, they are potentially more hazardous as a lifetime, but environmental health rarely looks at it through that lens. Things are starting to change, perhaps because of the work that's happened in the last 6 to 10 years, but they will start to look at it through a lens of just germs, and then you have to get them to look a little bit broader.
Yeah, our food safety laws in general, not just these California cottage food laws, but in general, our food safety laws are very focused on making sure people don't get sick, like, soon after consuming a food product. There's not a lot of laws kind of protecting our longer term health in the food system.
Well, I think in my chair's district, we have a similar like incubator organization called Calexico Neighborhood House, and they help people with the permits for cottage food, and so they have a lot of folks who come in. Calexico is right on the border of Mexico, with Mexicali on the other side with 1.5 million folks, and so they would have all these folks coming in wanting to sell food, and so many people coming across the border every day, and they said, you know, most of the time, they said maybe half the time people are coming in and asking how to sell things that aren't covered in the cottage food list. And when they say, oh, that's not covered, but you could make a fruit tamale or you could do this, they would say, okay, thank you, and then they would turn around and leave. And she said, we know that perfectly well that they're going to go out and keep doing the thing that they were doing before, but you know, the cottage food list is, and I think the biggest critique from our perspective as well, and I know that Christina has been working hard to expand the list, is that it is very culturally specific, this list. When you think about granolas and muffins and such, there weren't as many foods that pertain to other groups of folks, immigrant communities and communities of color, that they felt like they really aligned with. So there was that dynamic as well for us as far as the push to expand the list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the environmental health regulators proposed a list, I think, from one of the Midwestern states that was very Eurocentric, and so we had this whole process of trying to add, you know, a kind of a list, more foods that reflect the diversity of California, and that's one of the reasons why we included a mechanism where you can petition the California Department of Public Health to add a food item to the list, but they're only going to accept or approve your petition and add the food item to the list if it meets their kind of scientific definition of not potentially hazardous. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to help folks figure out how to like petition to add something in the current law. But yeah, it's like it's limited kind of so much that the petition process is not going to address all the concerns there are about it.
There are a couple of states, including Pennsylvania, that are much more liberal than what they allow for cottage foods. I believe they're one of the few states that allows jerky, which once made is actually very stable. But most states say it's too hard to make.
Yeah, there are a few other states that have a more like open-ended, they don't have like a specifically defined list of foods, but just if your food meets this level of water activity and this pH standard, then you can apply and make that food. Whereas I think our health regulators felt more comfortable having like a defined list of allowed foods. So again, this is a long negotiation process with environmental health regulators and trying to get to something that they felt like they could enforce.
Can I just say something real quick? I went to at the Happy Girl Kitchen, and they had a couple from Minnesota there, and so their law is completely different. They allow pickles, they allow a lot of things that we don't allow, but then like they don't allow chocolate chip cookies, and we do. So it's kind of state by state, I guess. Right?
So did you want to talk about any other pros and cons of the cottage bill? The cottage act?
Well, I think we're not really here to talk about pros and cons of the cottage food law, but I think like we want to talk about AB 626. And so I don't know if one of you want to start about pros and cons about that.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about inviting somebody from environmental health, and we didn't get anybody, so we're going to speak a little bit about them. So I do want to mention something else that happened regarding the health aspects of this, but I do think we want to move off into other things after that. Katie and I were at the Senate Health Committee hearing, as was Christina. Sorry, you were there too. And I thought a very interesting exchange happened as part of the hearing. The Health Committee Chair, Senator Pan, who is Dr. Richard Pan from Sacramento, asked one of the health department officers who was up there in opposition, very seriously and point blank, can this be done safely? And just as seriously and point blank, the health officer from Santa Clara said, in my opinion, there is no way to do it safely. So that level of opposition that we heard from 6 years ago with the cottage food law is still out there. What was very interesting is that the mic was passed to Senator Holly Mitchell, who then addressed this health officer from Santa Clara County. And she said, 6 years ago, you sat there and told me that the cottage food law could not be passed safely. And now I hear you touting it as a success. And I wasn't too familiar with the food truck law, but then she said, and 3 years ago, you sat there and told me that we couldn't expand food trucks, that there would be all sorts of health ramifications, and there are none. And so quite frankly, you're sitting here for the third time telling me that this is going to be a health disaster, that we can't do it safely, and I don't believe you. So a lot has changed from the health perspective in the last 6 years, certainly from senators, from the public. To a certain extent, from health officers. I actually do quite a bit of work in San Mateo County, which is not going to be among the first half to opt in because their health officer and head inspector are both absolutely terrified, and they want other counties to prove to them that this isn't going to cause an epidemic of germ-related diseases. So things are happening, but certainly within environmental health, very slowly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's definitely the largest group of concerns that we're still dealing with is a pretty large contingent of institutional stakeholders who are adamantly opposed to the bill and in no way will offer us any additional process or protections or limitations. For example, we took raw milk products and raw oysters out. We said those are not allowed because the environmental health officers we work with just said the risk is just too high. And so I said, are there other foods we need to take off the table that are just too high? You know, do we need to take raw meat off the table? You know, like are there certain things that we should just say no to? Would that make it better? But ideologically, as Peter said, it's, and actually I thought of you, Christina, after my meeting with the Department of Public Health about this bill a couple of weeks ago because it was just completely adamant. I mean, you would think that we're all lucky to be alive growing up eating out of home kitchens. And so that, you know, we're not all dropping dead every time somebody brings food over to our house is just a mystery to them. So I think for us, the other, we have with this bill, so I grew up in Kern County, and my author represents the border region of California, and so we have jokingly what I always refer to as my tamale lady threshold. Every time somebody asks us for a change, like I'm thinking about the women that I've talked to in his district and the people that I know who do this to think, is this something they can reasonably attain? Like, is this something that they can reasonably do? So we've taken a lot of amendments that we think make a lot of sense, that just process-wise, we know it'll be tough to go through that big inspection. We know it'll be tough if somebody dropped in on you, but that's important. It's important for public health, so we've got to do it. The manager card was another big push we had. A lot of folks didn't think that we should require the food manager card. They think a food handler card was enough, and we've been pushing pretty hard on a food manager card, both because it's available online and it's pretty accessible, and because we think it's important. Even though it's harder, it's important that you have the highest level training you can. But there are other things that we have not done, that we can't find a way to do. And to give you a picture of sort of what we're looking at as far as, obviously the criminalization of this activity is pretty rampant. We've had several folks who've worked on this bill with us, who Maritza in Stockton, who's also on the Cook Alliance Advisory Board, who was charged with several misdemeanors just for selling leftover food through a Facebook group where they basically did a sting. And my favorite comment of hers at the health committee was like, you know, we have all these unsolved murders and this crazy high crime rate, and yet you're sending enforcement officers to patrol my Facebook page for the leftover dinner food servings that I'm selling to my neighbors online who are knowingly purchasing it from me at my home. The internet groups in Sacramento, so there was this bill that was introduced this year by Mr. Cunningham, I believe, that was going to tell Lyft and Uber that they can't hire drivers who have sexual assault convictions, which when I read the bill, I was like, duh. I mean, that seems reasonable. And that bill was gutted before it even got to its first policy committee. You know, we're right now even trying to just require them to put in place incentives for drivers to drive cleaner vehicles, to do pooling of people, and are getting met very hard and fast by very swift opposition from these groups. And so we've been dancing, I feel like, a tightrope between wanting to, for the first time, I mean, because cottage food and these other laws, they didn't really talk about third-party intermediaries at all. And so we agreed with the environmental health regulators and with SELC that this is a concern. We don't want folks to be exploited. But how do we do that without killing the bill? And how do we do that while still allowing this process to move forward and recognize that there is obviously a very big conversation that we need to have. Our regulations and our laws are not equipped for what's happening right now in our economy, and we need to talk about that. So the provisions that we've put into this bill they seem like not a lot as far as requiring disclosures and doing all of the things, but they're precedent setting for these industries. And I think the fact that we've been able to get it this far is solely because it is impacting the food economy that folks really believe in. I mean, we've gone through the assembly has 80 members. You know, we did a full floor vote, 2 committees. We've only gotten 1 no vote in the entire process. So I think if it wasn't for the fact that we were legalizing or trying to legalize something that's really important, I don't think we would have even gotten the provisions that we've had in there. As far as liability, as far as disclosures, making them clear and conspicuous, making sure, you know, I would like to take it further and even say explicitly that platforms can't require cooks to cook certain products or during certain times. You know, like some platforms, the driver platforms will require you to like drive from 9 to midnight on Friday night or whatever. Like, can we go a little further with this? But that is probably, I think, the biggest unanswered question for us is like, how far can we push this without pushing it too far and killing the entire point for us, which is to make this an allowable activity for folks who are already doing it at a pretty large scale. And I think another step for us when I talk about my Somali Lady threshold, so I'm one of the incorporating board members for the new Sacramento Community of Interest. Yay. Which finally launched 2 months ago after probably 3 years of work, and I'm somehow got nominated to be the one who did all the nonprofit filing paperwork, which I would love to go back to that board meeting and unvolunteer myself for that. But obviously, if you're going to exceed $25,000 as a nonprofit, you know, you have to fill out the long form for the federal government. It costs several $100s to file. It's highly recommended that you hire an accountant to look over your paperwork if you're going to do that. It's not an easy thing. So I think if we were talking about this bill in a world where nonprofit and cooperative resources existed everywhere, and particularly in the communities that I care the most about, then this would be a very different conversation. But the reality is that it doesn't. And this is the same conversation I had with public health. I said, if there was a commercial kitchen in South Sacramento that these folks could use, you would hear me being a lot less adamant that this bill move forward, but it doesn't. It's not available. It's not accessible. I wish it was. You know, we've talked openly in our office about other bills we could do to try to make that more of a reality. But I think for this bill and this case and this problem we're trying to solve, my Tamale Lady threshold says, and my political acumen is telling me that we're pushing it about as far as we can. But I'm open to the discussion tonight, obviously, or else, you know, I wouldn't have driven the 2.5 hours to come over here to see if there's other ideas and things we could be doing to achieve our shared goals. Since, as Christina said, it's nice to be talking about this bill in a space where not everybody wants to tell me horror stories of deadly turkey Thanksgivings and spoiled things, and I have to sit there and very politely say, like, let's be real. Not to downplay the risk, there is obviously risk, but yeah, anyways, I'll pass it.
The data is not there.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to talk about some of our concerns now, if that's okay with her.
I think she just gave you an
Panel.
opening.
Yeah, so I think something that Katie has been alluding to is that the power of the gig economy tech companies is enormous in Sacramento, and it's impacting this bill, and that's where our concerns stem from. We're agnostic on the food safety debate. Like I don't agree with the health regulators that it's impossible to do this safely. I think it's a matter of kind of, nuts and bolts of reasonable restrictions and food safety education and other requirements. But our concern is the role that the tech companies are playing in this bill. So to give you some kind of context, this bill was introduced at the behest of a for-profit tech company called Josephine. I think Josephine for a while was trying to market itself as some sort of food justice organization, but to be clear, Josephine, it's apparently closed down now, but it was a for-profit venture capital-backed tech company. They had received venture capital financing from a firm that had been an early investor in Uber, among other investors. And they had a platform for connecting eaters and home cooks until that platform got shut down because it was operating in violation of all these food safety laws we're talking about here. But Josephine was just one of many tech companies. I've lost count actually of how many tech startups are in the business of facilitating sales of homemade food, because a lot of them come to our organization for legal advice, and they insist there must be some way to do this legally. Like, you lawyers must be able to figure out some loophole. Like, they just won't take no for an answer. And there's so many of them, and it's not just new tech startups. It's now companies like Airbnb wanting to add on food sales to the array of experiences that they have on their platform. So Airbnb is now officially supporting this bill and having a big influence on it, I think. The cottage food law actually doesn't really allow internet sales. That's the interpretation of the California Department of Public Health, is that our existing cottage food law allows a cottage food producer to have a website or advertise their business on the internet, but the actual sales transactions are not supposed to take place through the internet. They're supposed to take place like in person at the home or at the farmer's market, or if you're selling through a retail outlet like a grocery store or a cafe, then the customer would come there. And actually, initially I was disappointed that this kind of change got made to the cottage food law in the legislative process. But in hindsight, I actually realize now it was maybe kind of a good thing to limit the role of internet companies in facilitating sales of transactions, now that we've seen the gig economy really develop and come to control so many other parts of our economy, like ride services and gigs and all kinds of things. So I think a lot of you probably know what I'm talking about when I talk about concerns in the gig economy, because it's been in the news a lot lately, but I'll just kind of summarize some of the issues we've seen with gig economy tech companies like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Handy, etc. These companies have workers providing services to people, but they don't classify workers as employees. They classify them as independent contractors, which allows these tech companies to make money off of the workers' labor, but without having to provide all the typical employment law protections that the labor movement has fought for centuries. So independent contractors on these platforms don't get a minimum wage, they don't get overtime, they don't have workers' compensation insurance to help out if they get injured or even killed on the job, which has happened before. There's in the food industry, now that there's all these food delivery apps coming up, like I listed down just some of the ones I could think of. There's Uber Eats, there's Seamless, there's Postmates, there's Grubhub, there's DoorDash, there's Caviar. among others. And there's been a lot of complaints from like restaurant owners that these services put enormous pressure on them to produce large volumes of food really quickly. Like they'll get a really big order and it's requested to be ready in 10 minutes or something crazy like that. And then the tech platform takes a cut of every transaction. So the restaurants they get less money than if someone orders directly from them. And then a lot of the workers at these restaurants complain that they don't get tips when someone orders from them, you know, through the app, because the customer's not actually coming into the restaurant anymore. But these apps are taking off because they provide customers with cheap and convenient and quick service, and consumers like things that are cheap and convenient, and that's what's driving the expansion of this market. And some of the whole food delivery scene is still kind of new and evolving, but something we've seen in other sectors of the gig economy is that there's one or a few platforms that really come to sort of monopolize or dominate the market, like Airbnb dominates its market. Uber and Lyft are sort of competitors, but Uber really has the lion's share of the transportation network market, and just controls that market in so many ways that one or a few companies end up being near monopolies, and so they can set the terms of participation. They sort of become participation gatekeepers, because once so many customers are on a given platform, the workers or the service providers kind of flock to that platform, even if the terms are not very great for the workers. Even if Uber takes like 25% of every ride transaction, it really dominates its market. So a lot of people, now even like taxi drivers are using Uber because that's where you get customers now. So these are all the problems with the gig economy. I could talk all night about that, but we're worried about these problems unfolding in the homemade food sector should one or a few of these food delivery apps or homemade food apps or something like Airbnb really come to be such a market dominating force, to be such a kind of like market gatekeeper in the homemade food sector. And we're especially worried about food systems workers because in the food sector, workers are among the lowest paid of all workers in our society. But that's workers who, for the most part, in restaurants, et cetera, they have those basic employment law protections like minimum wage and the other things I was just mentioning. If you put them into home kitchens and make them independent contractors working for these platforms, they lack those employment law protections. So this bill, AB 626, does not require the use of a web platform for selling food, but it's very much designed to facilitate sales through web platforms. Like Katie mentioned, there's this whole bill within the bill, as she called it, about third-party web platforms using basically facilitating transactions of food. So what to do about all of this? Obviously, there's some potential upsides to home cooks using a web platform to market their food. And if you're a home cook, you don't have a storefront on a busy commercial street. So how do you find customers? There's a lot that have luck with, kind of old-fashioned word of mouth. But a lot of cooks see some benefit to being able to advertise, on the internet or perhaps even on a web app, specifically designed for food sales. So our proposal, our kind of proposed alternative vision for the future of homemade food in California is this. Yes, we should absolutely expand the legal scope of homemade food sales to include lots of different kinds of food, everything but those ultra hazardous foods like raw oysters and things like that the health regulators just are most concerned about. But we should really open it up. I think on a lot of those points, we're all in agreement here. Our vision for the role of the tech platforms is different, though. We think that if cooks are selling through web applications or web platforms, that they should only be able to sell through a platform that's a cook-owned cooperative, or perhaps a cook and delivery driver-owned cooperative platform, or a nonprofit-owned platform, or a local government agency-owned platform, to prevent these, really giant Silicon Valley venture capital-backed tech companies from dominating this market. And you could say that's kind of an extreme proposal to only allow cooperatives and nonprofits to be, kind of market facilitators. But that's very similar to California's farmers market law that has existed for decades. In California, the entity that manages the farmers market, so the entity that pulls the permit to take over the street and that invites all the different farmers and vendors to the market, that entity must be a nonprofit or a local government or a farmer or a group of farmers. You cannot have like a Safeway, for example, operating a farmers market in California. That's illegal because of our farmers market regulations. So our proposal is not that different from how we regulate farmers markets currently, but it's sort of adapting that law to the future, to the internet economy and to the homemade food economy. And yeah, unfortunately, we have not been very successful in convincing the author to adopt this alternative vision into his AB 626, and I think that's because the power of big tech in our legislature is so enormous.
Thank you. So I just want to do a real quick, so it's 8:24. I'm still hoping to hear what California Slow Food has to think, or pros or cons about kind of what's being presented, but also leaving plenty of time for questions and answers. So, looks like, did you have a question also? Yeah. So, Peter, you want to speak for about 5 minutes or 7 about what Slow Food California thinks, and then we can move into question and answers pretty quickly?
That sounds good to me, if it works with everybody else. We did agonize over this, in part because we heard Christina and take the concern seriously. And we absolutely said that it had to be cook-friendly, cook first, and not internet platform first. My own point of view, being a refugee from Silicon Valley, who has recently sort of gone back and taking a contract with a startup firm that has VC, it's giving me a little bit of the creeps. They've actually got a really good business model that has nothing to do with this. I'll tell anybody who wants to know later. But the money behind it, how they keep thinking is, we're supporting the farmers. Well, yeah, but you also want to get filthy, stinking rich, and how long are you going to support the farmers? So I hear all of that, but they're out there, the VCs, and how much we can change things in one bill is a question that we certainly talked about in Slow Food California, and we said that the tying of the bills, the changing the laws for employment and for the internet are very valid concerns, but they don't necessarily have to be in this law, given how much opposition there will be, how much opposition there occasionally has been, as Katie listed, to some of the proposals that are in there. And we said, and this is something that the advisory board for the Cook Alliance talks about, and we have talked about all of those amendments and proposed amendments, is that we want to find ways to be cook-friendly. And we believe that there are ways other than Selk's amendment, that it has the likelihood of pushback that will kill this, and not just this year, but if it were submitted in another year, that likelihood will always be there, that the political mindset for doing what they want isn't necessarily there. We also talked a little bit about whether that was the right way to do it, that we believe that cooks are not drivers. I don't know if any of you use Lyft or Uber. I don't. But do you call up and say, I want Bob to drive me? And you probably don't. But with this kind of food, you do call up and you don't say, I want some mac and cheese, what's close to me? You say, I want Bob's food. There is room for commoditization to some extent, but it's very different than driving a car, that there is only so much you can commoditize it. I also think the analogies, and we talked about these within slow food, to farmers markets are not perfect either. For one, having helped establish a farmers market which then died, I can tell you that the nonprofits aren't always the most friendly. The biggest one, Pacific Coast Farmers Market Association, while it's been friendly enough to farmers, has forbid cottage food operators from the non-certified part of the market. I have talked to a few cooks, quite a number of cooks, about co-ops, and they say, well, how would we go about doing that? We're cooks, we don't have the energy. I've talked to them about the platforms they use, and that's mostly in the gray area. A number of them who teach use Cozy Meal. The fees are high, the fees bother me, but the exploitation, the telling them of what they have to do is fairly low, because they know the Cozy Meal knows they'll kill the goose who laid the golden egg, who's getting them those high fees if they push too much. The good chefs tend to try to move to their own website or to Yelp or to some other way that has lower fees. And so while we want this to be very cook-friendly, Slow Food had a very serious discussion. We take self's concerns and everybody else's concerns very seriously. Christina joined us on a call, as did Matt from the Cook Alliance, formerly from Josephine. And we said, we believe there are other ways to protect the cook, and we're going to try to work toward them.
Great. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with questions, I guess. Let's come up here just a hand courageous.
But, Sherry, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for your incredible thought leadership on this really important issue. And my question, I'll frame it like kind of in some historical context. Ironically, the Grange was formed, right, to eliminate the railroad middleman between the farmer and the consumer. Because at that time, in the turn of the century, the railroads were the gig economy, the Ubers and the Lyfts, and they were setting the prices, right? And to me, it's like that's a systemic issue that I think we're going to have to tackle as a culture, because people can't get ripped off without organizing eventually. But my real question for both of you, I'd like to hear both points of view, is about penalties. So right now, with no law, right, with no protection for people that are trying to make a living or supplement their living out of their kitchen, what is the criminalization of that? And if you, and my question for you, Christina, is that if you were to just have a farmer's market type or nonprofit or cooperative type, would the person still be criminalized for making the choice to go with internet-based company? What would that look like?
Well, that's a good question, and enforcement is always a challenge with any law anywhere. So under AB 626 and under our kind of proposal or our alternative vision, you wouldn't have to use one of these designated web platforms. Like if you were a home cook and you just wanted to tell your friends and family and neighbors, hey, I'm selling food, that would be totally allowed. But if you were to choose to use one of these web platforms that was designed for selling food, it would have to be a platform that was a cooperative or a nonprofit or a local government. So ideally there would be decent enough enforcement that there just wouldn't really be much of a market for something like Uber Eats or something else like that in the homemade food economy. And if things went well, there would be a number of nonprofits, cooperatives, and things like that would, would hopefully fill different kind of regional needs or other different niches in this market. Something similar happened sort of by accident in Austin, Texas, when the city council imposed regulations on Uber and Lyft that Uber and Lyft didn't like. So Uber and Lyft left Austin for over a year, and in the meantime, all these different alternative ride-hailing apps popped up. So there's a nonprofit called Ride Austin now. There's a cab driver-owned cooperative that formed. There's some like informal groups, through Facebook where there's not really like a dedicated app that people are using. And there's some other like smaller businesses that are not cooperatives or nonprofits, but just like other smaller tech companies that sprung up. And my point is that we need to create the kind of regulatory space for those community-based alternative local businesses to start, because once you let something like Uber or Airbnb dominate a market, it's so hard for any alternative to be viable. So that's the kind of goal of our alternative vision, is to create that time and space for communities to develop alternatives that work for them.
So, and to clarify one, I think, important point, food delivery services are expressly not allowed under the bill as it's currently written. It's all direct sales. So it still has to be from the cook themselves to the actual consumer, whether it's one of their employees going to deliver or them coming to the home. Right now, what you're seeing in terms of penalties seems to vary at local discretion. So we see things from cease and desist orders to misdemeanor charges, depending on the severity and what the local enforcement officer decides is appropriate. So one thing we're hoping will happen is more of a standardization of, if you do a drop-in inspection and there is a violation, you're paying that fee for that inspection. They still have the ability to pull your permit, but we're trying to lower that overall threshold. And I also just want to clarify as well that there's a lobbyist for Airbnb who doesn't even come into my office anymore. He walks in and he looks for the chief, for the author, and if the chief isn't there, he walks right back out, because I have pages and pages of amendments that they've submitted to me that I have not accepted. And I've gone toe-to-toe with them for hours upon hours. We have taken some of their feedback because they are one of these platforms and we want it to work for them. But I've literally been forwarded emails from the chief that's just like, they'll send them an email and say, we need to talk, and he'll reply and copy me and say, talk to Katie, and then I get nothing, because they just refuse to engage with me at this point, at least on the offhand. So I just want to make clear that I definitely, like I say, and like we've been saying, we understand. We also think that the sort of utopian perspective of what nonprofits do isn't necessarily appropriate either. I've had to file 2 labor complaints in my life, and they were both against a nonprofit I was working for that was paying me nothing. It was bouncing my checks and causing me to work and demanding me to do things that were beyond the scope of my job description. So just because someone is a nonprofit doesn't necessarily make them an angel, right? And I was doing some of my best work as a for-profit consultant who was just governed by values and principles and marketing myself to groups who share those values and principles. So I think as we have this conversation, it's important for us to recognize that all sectors have a gradient of players. And that is important, as Peter said, that we put in protections that are translatable and real, which is why we've talked about putting in additional protections around setting costs, setting hours, doing those things. That would be more of a push than we can do right now. We need the support of organizations like yours if we would ever get that through. But we've talked about how we can make that meaningful. These platforms in many cases offer liability insurance coverage for cooks at no additional cost other than the fee. Josephine, the platform that's referenced, charged, I think it was 2 to 3% was their fee. So it was very minimal. 10%. It was 10%? Mm-hmm. Oh, really? Well, we've talked about capping it at 5 or 10%, but these sort of things where they were offering training, they were doing the marketing, they were going in and they were giving the food handler training to these cooks. So it is important to recognize that there are services that are available through these platforms. When I got liability insurance for my consulting business, it was $800 a year. That's nothing to sneeze at. It's not something we want people to go into without having insurance coverage, because there is obviously a lot of risk. So it's just, for us, it's not so black and white. And like I say, with our Tamale Lady threshold, as much as I would love these platforms to exist in really rural parts of the state like Calexico, they don't. And for us to tell people that they can't use those platforms mean that they might use them anyways and then subject themselves to continued criminalization. And that's not something that we find acceptable either. So we engage with Airbnb because they offer us choices, and what we've asked from SELC is what else can we do? And we've been asking since the bill was introduced and the opposition was made formal, what else can we do? Can we say that you are like you can't be independent? I mean, like what is it that we can be doing that's something that isn't this such an extreme measure? And I would love if you all have feedback. I know we're running short on time. We're very open to those ideas.
And I can briefly, before we take another question,
Well,
tell you.
Peter, I just want to, I currently see 3 hands up, and I know that we only have like 20 more minutes.
Okay, but
So-
nonprofits aren't going to get below 10% because ones who are doing similar work are in that range as it is. We could talk more about fees.
What are you talking about for
The fees for
Oh.
hosting you, some of them are up around 30%, and that really bothers me.
Oh.
But 10% is pretty good.
Okay, so just in the order I saw, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Elizabeth and
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth and
Maria.
Okay, so we'll do that. Go ahead.
So how do these tech companies get around the $50,000 threshold?
Well, it's by cook, so it's not by a company. So in theory, if there was a statewide coverage of a company and they had a lot of cooks subscribed, the threshold doesn't apply to them. They would apply, it's based on the cook's gross annual sales and adjusted for inflation each year.
So what if it applied to them? Wouldn't that bring it away? That would just eliminate this problem.
Well, and that's what we've talked about in terms of like potentially capping the fee, is like if we said it can't be more than, 10%, then again, we have conversations like Peter just said, which is, if we're trying to help, like if we want nonprofit and cooperative platforms to be able to compete if they're charging more, does that make sense? If we want them to offer these additional services like insurance and such, does this still make sense? But it's something we've discussed.
Ruby?
Okay. In an effort to be concise, I so appreciate all of your work on this complex issue. Like, it's so dynamic. I feel like we have to look at what people are actually doing, what producers are doing, and think about, first of all, that's the direction everything's moving. It's all moving towards DIY, do-it-yourself, grassroots, out of your home, like music, all different sectors. So now we just need to create something that's going to protect the producer and what they're doing. And I feel like, and I know very little about this, that they are going to be using these platforms if they can, like Facebook or, and what we need potentially to do is to create protection around that. And to look at what is probably going to happen, the path of least resistance, and create a lot of law, and to get it right the first time as much as we can in a way that really supports where we see it kind of going. And I understand where you're coming from. You're like I don't even want to go in that direction because all I see is abuse, but in another way, I can understand your perspective. It's just that's probably where it's going to go. So, is there a way to encourage them to move in these, to broaden those other opportunities to make that the path of least resistance for them to work together in a community sense, while also creating protection if they do go more corporate? And by creating those restrictions on corporations that constrain them from abuses, are we then, by doing that, channeling people into grassroots working together? Because that's the easier route. So that's more of a statement.
Yeah.
It was a good summary of the perspectives.
So I'm going back to the fees, because I think that it'd be important to cap the fees or something, or create some kind of package to the benefits that the fees must provide for the cook. Because otherwise, they say they could offer it, but it's not committed to, and then if they're charging 30% and they're offering it, then they're getting gouged. And in regards to the kind of the communities I care most about, I know their language access and their literacy access and their understanding of what those contracts with those providers would be. And I'm wondering if there's anything in the bill that ensures that if there is an internet contract, that there's some kind of legal buy-in to make sure that they understand what they're signing up for. Because if I'm thinking of the Central Valley or even the Central Coast rural communities that don't speak English, that don't read, or even Spanish in some cases, they might be signing up for something that is easy enough, and then they have conflict of contract agreements, not fully understanding what's being asked of them through these platforms. They're not as tech savvy either, so I am concerned about, or want to know if there's anything around that space, but definitely encouraging a fee cap and a package of benefits that must be included in order to provide the services for the public.
Yeah, and I guess, that's been a part of our conversation for probably over a year now. I think our problem is we're having trouble figuring out where to set that fee cap and what to require. That would make it meaningful. A lot of these platforms already do offer a lot with the fees, so it's like not something that they couldn't meet, but it's like, where's that number? If like folks are going, if nonprofits are over at 30, do we say 25? And that's more of like a, pull up. But to your second question, I spent a lot of time with the Judiciary Committee consultants about that specific component, and like right now what the bill says was like clear and conspicuous, because what I didn't want was like a disclaimer at the bottom of a page that was written in 10-point font that said like, and then like somebody says like, oh, okay, accept. But I would very much love ideas. They felt like legally, as far as what they'd seen in the law, that it was going as far as they'd ever seen, but as far as making it meaningful was like clear and conspicuous is like a legal threshold that they felt like was meaningful enough. But if there's other ideas or models that we could be taking into that, we ended up getting waived through Judiciary because we just took all, I was just like, tell me what the seats say, so that it's like, because they're concerned about the consumers and the cooks and making sure they weren't getting abused. But that is something that we struggle with, obviously, the English language in the part of the state that my chair represents, but also where I'm from is very limited, and so we're very concerned with that as well. But how do you, if there's a good model or an idea of like ways that we can word that, because there's a whole section in the bill you'll see somewhere in the 25 pages that's all about like, you must post this, you must post this, you must post this, so that we're like clearly outlining what must be included in this before they ever sign up. But I would love ideas. A clear and conspicuous was like one of the things that they said that there's precedent behind enforcing that when it wasn't meaningful and it was easy for someone to sign up without seeing it or knowing what they were signing. But
and follow-up question: do the fees that, if there's a cap, hopefully there is, and it's a package of benefits, a minimum bar set for that, do those fees include the payment fees? And are those being considered as well? So I'm talking if they're using Visa or MasterCard or credit card, usually there's a fee attached to that, right? That may be separate from the administration of the platform fee itself. And so I'm wondering if that's being looked at. What I'm concerned is about almost predatory lending behavior cropping up into this space with people that don't have credit, financial, whatever it is, and inadvertently hurting them on their financial future as well. So I guess making sure that the understanding of what the fees cover and don't cover, and the transparency of the transactional fees that the cook might be on top of everything.
Well, and even, if you think about the very nature of who would use the platform, the very idea is that you have a bank account that money is getting deposited into, right? And so already these platforms are precluding the engagement of a whole segment of the population who doesn't have bank accounts for a whole variety of reasons, right? So like there's, and that's why I said I jump into this so quickly because this is something that we've mapped out and debated so much, and Peter can attest to the conversations is how do we I consider Josephine as a good actor when they were active, and so we always talked about how do we make sure everybody is at that level, because we don't want, and they didn't want to open the door to something that would go below the level of service that they felt like they were offering to those cooks. And so that opens a whole nother door as if we say that it's per, there's slimy folks, right, sometimes. So it's if I say it's per transaction, now you're going to start charging a fee to sign up, or a daily use fee. And if I say, well, daily use fees, then you're going to say, oh, well, it's if you operate during these hours, we might charge you differently. And so how do I word it in a strong enough way that they don't just create a process that circumvents the protections that we're trying to put in place? So I said, right now what you see in the bill is as much as we've been able to come up with that we have confidence in. As far as doing these additional things, meetings. They're not something we've ever said we wouldn't do. We just struggle with figuring out how to operationalize that. And the state isn't very good at that type of nuanced policy development. So I have cards here, and I apologize that I didn't bring more printed materials with me, but I would love to keep talking with you about ideas, or if there's models elsewhere, or if you've seen contracts elsewhere that you're like, this is a really cool way to do that. But we're very cognizant of, if we say you do this, and then they say, cool, we're gonna do it on Thursday, and you're like, oh crap, now we just missed like the very intent of the thing we were trying to do.
Okay, and then real quick, so I think it looks like Christina has a rebuttal, and then Sherry has a comment or question, and Elizabeth had her, what's your name, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Has her hand raised as well, and then we'll probably kind of try to go into closing after those statements. And maybe
I'll
Peter
just
can do
try to
it.
respond to kind of like both of your questions and comments a little bit. Like, as Katie said, it's so tricky to just kind of, you know, put our alternative, you know, kind of community ownership proposal aside and say, well, we'll address these concerns by just having, you know, a cap on fees, because there's so many complications around that, and we still don't know what's actually a reasonable fee, what's an exploitative fee, and it could vary depending on what the platform provides. But besides the issue of fees, that's a really, really big issue. But there's so many other issues that are that crop up with the gig economy that are not addressed in this bill. So like the question of liability is a huge question in my mind. So like with Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, there's been, and all these gig economy tech companies, actually there was a delivery worker with Caviar who was just killed in an accident while making a delivery. So that there's been a lot of litigation where there's this open question that the courts need to grapple with about who is liable if something goes wrong. Is the platform liable? Is the service provider liable? Are they both liable? And what's happened with other parts of the gig economy is like eventually there are rules written that tech platforms need to provide liability insurance. So in California now, there are rules that Uber and Lyft must provide liability insurance for their drivers, but we didn't have that at first when Uber and Lyft were operating, and it created a lot of litigation. And so that, like, you know, that's an issue we know is going to come up with homemade food sales on platforms. So but it's not addressed in the bill. There's a lot of these tech platforms that have these forced arbitration agreements, which are often not, like, really not like consumer friendly and really not friendly to like the least powerful party in the agreement. And going back to your comments about like language barriers, you know, most of the users on these platforms like do not understand the terms of service, and forced arbitration clauses can prevent people from pursuing claims regarding their like lack of employment law protections and all kinds of other things like that. And there's so many other kind of tricky terms and conditions that other gig economy tech platforms have. Like, you need to respond to a certain number of requests for rides or services in a short amount of time, otherwise you get kicked off the platform. Like, these tricks that sort of that they employ to get workers to like stay on the platform longer, to accept requests for services even when they're not really in the workers' financial interest. And it just seems like these gig economy companies come up with more of these tricks every day. And I could assemble a team of brilliant lawyers to like work on this all year, and we probably couldn't come up with something that would, you know, address for all of these concerns. So so that's why we sort of keep going back to our vision that like homemade food, you know, that like fundamentally the policy needs to ensure that the community really owns and controls the whole economy, not just individual cooks in their home kitchens.
Liability is the one thing we haven't been able to address, but we can talk about.
They drive or whatever, so I'm not quite clear how the you know, the platforms are even applicable at all. If that's the law.
They would basically, the way that it would work is they could facilitate a sale. So I could like either reserve or pay through a platform to say I want to come to your house for tonight. I could reserve it and pay for it through the platform, or like that sort of way, but I'm still needing to engage directly with either the cook themselves or their employee.
Right. So you're like the tech company is a subcontractor or whatever, or a service provider of the chef.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's clear. So my idea is actually California has already legislated a similar solution in the healthcare industry, where, you know, for the Affordable Care Act on the market exchanges, you basically have a set of options and services that as a health insurer you gotta provide the consumer. That has to be clear, has to be disclosed, and then your profit, if you make any more profit than whatever their formula is, all of the parties involved, all of the subscribers get a refund at the end. So there's some kind of formula that the California legislature figured out with a very powerful lobby, the healthcare industry, and I get a check from Blue Shield as a participant in Cover California. You know, like they hold our money in trust and then they kick it back at the end of the year, so that it ensures that the profit motive is not completely in control.
So the idea would be that the platforms would hold any profit that they make and then redistribute it to the cooks?
Yes. So any, you know, they have their formulary, you have your, you have, here's.
To me. I was gonna say, I think that sounds like a
Exactly, that's what I'm saying, you asked for a solution, I just thought of that, I'm like, well, here's this really powerful, you know, group of lobbyists that, I don't know how correlated it is, but it seems like your request for a list of non-negotiables that have to be provided as a food, you know, internet vendor, at least that has a model, a similar model. In our California legislature, we've made that happen in another industry.
Well, and that model wouldn't be precluded from happening in the bill as it's written. I think the big difference with the healthcare is obviously everybody's required to participate in the healthcare system, so there's a certain different dynamic happening there, and that you have to have insurance under the Affordable Care Act. But yeah, I mean, like, we're very supportive of the cooperative models and the nonprofit models that are out there.
Well, I don't know if I have a question necessarily, or, so my perspective is, I'm thinking, this bill sounded something more like it was for like a personal chef who's already got all their licensing and everything. And what I do is I go to the homes and I cook. So, you know, that's all been set up for quite a long time. So then I'm thinking, oh, wouldn't that be great if instead of lugging all of my equipment every time, I could cook and deliver the food. But I'm getting the feeling from this, and this is a great discussion, this is going to get like this big crazy thing with the tech companies and all these rules and regulations, that I really think that who you're really looking to bring into the fold and protect is not going to happen, unfortunately, because the people that are pushing this, it sounds like, are the ones with the money, and they don't care about the little people.
Well, I mean, just to be clear in our defense, because we're the ones pushing the bill, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's our office and we're the ones doing this for the people that we're doing it for. I think the bill is really complicated, and it makes me sad that it's so complicated, and I'm hopeful that, you know, if it passes and is signed, that we can find a really great way to make this more accessible to folks, because otherwise it can be pretty onerous. But you, and exactly what you described, is still totally allowable under the bill as it's written. And so if you don't want to participate with the tech platform, if you have your clients and you say, hey, rather than me dirty your kitchen, I'm just going to bring you food on Monday, still totally allowed under this bill as it's written. So I think I just want to make sure that we're getting very much into the weeds here, but like that very pure activity that you're talking about doing, nothing precludes that. And if you have clients who like your food, like they're still going to buy from you for your food. I'm not going to suddenly go to a platform for the 20
I would never go to a platform.
Yeah.
So I want to take my like moderator hat off and put my participant hat on, but like I've worked with a lot of direct marketers and a lot of startup businesses, and like to cook food and to like take payments and to figure out if I'm going to get a check from a restaurant, or if they're going to pay it, or if it's going to bounce, or if I want to, and then to also get product liability insurance, and then also to, now I'm supposed to have my own website too. Like what? No way. I'm just trying to cook something and sell it. So, and I think that if Uber was such a shitty platform, then why do we have so many Uber drivers who are signing up as individual contractors to try to make a different kind of wage? So there is some kind of quid pro quo that is there for individual people. And I think that so to just blanket statement and not address it or let individuals choose whether they want to use it or not. Because I can't even create my own website, and I sit on a computer all day long. I have no idea what to do. And like, so just to kind of plug and play and have someone else filter in, payment seems advantageous. So I think that there is two sides to this coin, and no one's being forced to use the platform. I'm also thinking about like what your opinion is, because he does run a community kitchen, and actually this bill prevents his nonprofit from breaking even to have more people who want to rent out maybe a space. And I shouldn't put words in your mouth. Yeah. But there's a lot of different angles here that we haven't even talked about. Yeah. And so this is just one space, and that is a nonprofit, and more home cooks actually creates a new competition threshold for the cooperative businesses. And cooperatives as a whole do not equal patronage fees. Like, I know so much about cooperatives. They are so complex. There's so much inter-arguing. There's so much legal documentation. That's why there's not that many cooperatives. So it's like, so we're getting into a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different spaces, but just recognizing that this is where we are today. People are doing internet sales to push their agendas, individual, political, or economic. And then how do we, within that, cultivate a space that is opportunistic for both the producer and recognizes a gig capitalist economy, in which is systemic, and global. So I don't know, those are big questions. It seems like you guys are tackling little chunks at a time. Sorry to just grab onto that one. But I don't know if there's anybody else who has any other comments, and then maybe Peter can wrap up, because I feel like Peter's good at doing that. Yeah, here.
So just really quick, we've done taxes for Uber drivers, and they don't understand what they sign up for as contractors. So they end up owing a bunch of taxes on tax season, and they didn't know that. So I think that disclosure about contracting, and I don't know if it's in this bill, but there's a lot of issues on the small providers that are becoming self-employed, and the tax implications of that, and they don't understand it. So they're not paying their quarterly taxes, and then they get the big bill at the end of the year.
And that's the whole thing. I mean, and that's been, I think, for me, the theme with this bill is that, like, we're trying to tackle these issues as much as we can that are really much broader systemic issues. Like when I was self-employed, and I got stuck with the big annual bill, and I was like, problem with that. So, I mean, you just don't know.
So part of what I want to get to is that there are a lot of big systemic issues. And what this bill is essentially doing is creating a new market. A new market with big systemic issues that are problematic, especially for the community that you're saying you're trying to benefit. And with that, I can clearly understand the intention of Christina's point of don't open up the Pandora box when it's so complicated to bring it back in. Because in my concern is that you're right, you're not going to word everything right. Something's going to happen. But what usually happens is that the communities of color who don't understand their rights or abilities or access get exploited, and you're going to create a low-wage home cook market that's going to put aside those that are barely making any money, and they're going to become dependent on maximum $50,000 gross a year without feeling like they can move. And I think from a systemic standpoint, it's actually creating more problems than benefits for the same community you're trying to create. Not even getting into immigration statuses for those contractors that are going to need to do the W-9s and all of that for those platforms. So just, I completely understand the want to bring in launching a whole new market without fully understanding the unintentional consequences that could happen, especially for communities of color.
So perhaps the way to wrap it up is to go back to something that Katie said before. I disagree with one thing you said. We're not creating a new market particularly. We're organizing or regulating within our abilities a market that exists anyway. And I divide the world into at least 4 pieces. One of them is the private chefs, and that is perfectly legal under the current law to cook in somebody else's house. And very few of them use a platform because they all tend to have a reputation. They have different ways of getting into other people's houses, and you become that person's employee, and it's their facility. The next two are sort of related, and a good friend of mine does both of them. One is she teaches classes in her own house. Yes. And the other one is that she occasionally has a pop-up restaurant in her dining room. Neither one of them is defined in current law, so they are neither legal nor illegal. They are often defined in zoning law that you're not allowed to have that many people in your house. You're not allowed to have that business in your house. And that's a totally different issue. But there are services out there, including Cozy Meal, who have many customers who are teaching and doing pop-up restaurants. I think their fees are exorbitant. I actually believe that 11% is a very reasonable fee. I've seen a couple of companies, for-profit and non-profit, operate in that, and it's really basic for the sales and marketing and insurance. The last one is the sales outside your door, the cooking for somebody else, the having them pick it up or delivering it. And from the law's point of view, that's the new market. From reality's point of view, that's probably the biggest one. And I would say two things, related things, that if this law passes, the majority of people who are cooking at their home and selling to you for either pickup or delivery will remain illegal. And most, if not all, of the tamale ladies will remain illegal. And I think we should encourage them, and I think there's some safety in this, and I think there are ways in the long run as we figure this out to benefit everybody, and it is not an easy question, but that's part of what it keeps coming back to. It's not really a new market, it's an unregulated mess in many ways.
It's like 9:05, but everybody's gonna have just one thing to say.
If we know a lot of people in this room, that maybe potentially we could give your contact information to.
Oh, that's good.
So, like, maybe would it be most helpful for us to refer, like, people who are lawyers, who know, like, actual legal like hardcore examples to you? Like, who should we send your way?
Everybody, so send everybody to us. And I do mean that. I mean, I field calls, everybody from the person who's selling food right now in Bakersfield to the large, lobbyist person who wants to know what this means for their clients. So I have cards here with me. I'm bummed that I didn't think to bring. I've been traveling a lot for my other part, 99% of my job this month, so I forgot to bring fact sheets so you could see the supporters and the folks we've been working with. But I think if you have case studies, other examples from other jurisdictions, it doesn't need to be someone who's a lawyer, but someone who has an idea that we can spring off of to try to more fine tune this bill. Everything's welcome. We meet with everybody.
And I will put a sheet up on the desk there if you want to put your name and email, and you can send things to her, whatever. So.
And I brought copies of my op-ed that ran in the LA Times for anyone who wants to take when they're here. And I also have an email sign up if you want to get news from us about this bill and other food system issues.
They have great newsletters. Cartoon squirrels teach you the law.